Good evening. My name is Phil Schomber. I'm the adult programmer here at Hedberg, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming here tonight as we kick off Fake News Month. And if that's something you're interested in participating in, there are a number of different ways you can do that. We'll be putting up Facebook posts throughout the month that will test your ability to spot true and false stories, so you can be on the lookout for that. You can also join us in our Reading on the Rock book discussion group on Thursday night, September 27th. They'll be discussing the book, The Truth Seeker's Handbook. I apologize for that. And that reviews some of the mental mistakes that we're all prone to that cause us to believe certain things that aren't true. And you'll want to come back next Tuesday night. Mary Bulow, the head of our Information Services Department, will be doing a program on fighting fake news and filter bubbles. There's a lot of information out there coming from many different sources, and Mary's going to talk about some of the things that we can do to sort through everything and discern what's true and what isn't. So that's just some of the things that we have coming up, but let's kind of move on with tonight's program, the reason that you're all here tonight. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker, Nathan Fuller. Nate is the education curator at the Rock County Historical Society, and he's here tonight to share some of the cherished stories in American history where things may not have actually happened the way that we think they did. And he'll also share some stories that are absolutely true, but that have been forgotten over time, and so may not have been part of the American story that we grew up hearing about. So, would you please welcome Nathan Fuller.
Thank you, Phil. That was a great intro, and thank you all for coming tonight. This is the first event for Fake News Month. This is a collaboration that we had talked about with the Hedberg Public Library and the Rock County Historical Society. And it's not to take a flippant attitude towards fake news, or in this case, we're talking about alternative facts. It's really to kind of educate you that, just because there's an established narrative out there doesn't necessarily mean it's the right one, or sometimes it's one that's been muddled over time. And so what we've decided we wanted to do was kind of cut through some of that noise that we've heard from all sides, and to learn about what exactly, in terms of history, what kind of events were kind of changed, so how some invented, and then how are some are just totally wrong. So we're really excited about this. As Phil mentioned, you can check out our Facebook feed, the Rock County Historical Society. We're putting out about 2 posts a week. One's a little more informative. One of them is going to be a little bit more funny. That's if you check out on Friday, you'll learn about a story developing out of Scotland. And this is kind of a way for us to understand about what exactly do historical untruths and how does that kind of mix in with this whole idea of fake news. We really wanted to take a very proactive element to it because it is a problem, and it's an issue that's been through in American history for a long time. So we really wanted to highlight that throughout this month. So it's the first program, and we're so glad that you're here with us tonight. I should mention, too, we also are going to have a book display outside somewhere in the library that will have some book recommendations that you can read, whether it's historical or something that relates to fake news. So if you wanted to learn more, you can check that out as well. So what inspired me to do this program? By the way, I called it Alternative Facts for a reason. And the reason, of course, is Kellyanne Conway. This is not exactly a flattering picture for her, so I apologize if there's any Kellyanne Conway fans out here. But when I heard that reference to alternative facts, it was about a year ago, and the idea was that they were talking about the numbers at the inauguration, and basically, what was the alternative fact? Well, it gave an idea, a number that he kind of felt right. And in this context, when an alternative fact, she's really more talking about an untruth, right? But how does alternative facts kind of play out in American history? To be perfectly honest, alternative facts are all over the place in history. They're just in a little bit different way. We're not talking about something that we're trying to tamp down actual truth. We're actually talking about how in history there's a lot of stories that we've heard about that aren't necessarily the whole story. They're usually a kind of a snippet. There's a piece that we really like, that we kind of cherish too, or there's one that's an entire narrative that's been invented. And so we talk about alternative facts. I'm talking about cherished American stories that we've always heard and that are just kind of not quite the right lens to be looking at it. And as a historian, I think it's very important to understand that people today and people in the past have pretty much the same ideas about their lives. They want to live, they want to be respected, they want to have kids, they want to eat, they want to be housed, and they want to die with dignity. Those are things that connect us between past and present. And when we talk about these stories, oftentimes they fit into some sort of narrative, and that narrative can be really positive, and sometimes it can be really negative. So when we talk about alternative facts in history, we're really trying to talk about kind of get what does these things actually mean in a historical context, and also understand how do historical untruths come about? How do they develop? Sometimes it's just the nature of human nature. We want something to be true, so it becomes true. And sometimes we invent things because we want them to be part of a larger story. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those cherished American stories tonight. And by the way, there's a disclaimer: controversial, historically researched discussion contained within. You have been warned. I guarantee you'll hear a story tonight that you probably say, well, I heard it this way when I was in 5th grade, and that's the story that I always stuck to. I apologize for that. I'm not trying to be a troublemaker, but most historians are troublemakers. So generally, we're not trying to ruin everybody's day, but it does happen. And there are no sacred American stories here tonight. And it will maybe make you a little upset to hear about this. I'm going to avoid some of the larger narrative. When we talk about things like slavery and stuff, that could be a whole month worth of programming right there. We'll only touch on that a little bit. But we're taking a historical approach beyond the factoids and the memorable information and trying to really dig into some of these stories. So I start off with a little humor here tonight. This is a clip from The Simpsons. By the way, context-wise, this Simpsons episode is one where Lisa takes to task a historical story in her own town of Springfield about the story of Jebediah Springfield. And by the way, Jebediah Springfield wasn't exactly who he said he was. In fact, it turns out he's a pirate. Sorry, spoiler alert if you haven't seen that episode. But there's a whole thing where Lisa gets basically labeled as something called a PC thug, politically correct thug. I'm not trying to be a PC thug tonight, too, but I'm just going to try to throw it out here. I think you'll enjoy it, and it kind of is the same context we're talking about. The idea here is that some stories are just so cherished in our collective narrative that we don't want them to be challenged. We want things to be true. We want things to be neat and tidy and have no nuance to it because those things are easily digestible. Just like there's a choice between having an amazing breakfast and your standard cereal. Sometimes that cereal just tastes better because it's simple. It doesn't have any nuance to it. But to be honest, American history is more complex. It's more messy than we technically want it to be. And as historians, sometimes kind of feel like you're out to ruin people's day because we're not trying to be negative. We're not trying to sound like we're changing the story. But in reality, we're expanding the narrative. We're making it a bigger story. Oftentimes, people like to think, if you think about history as more of a novel, there's different chapters in there, right? Different stories entail. Sometimes people just want to read that little word or that sentence or that chapter of American history and not go beyond. But we're trying to expand that narrative to something else. So, of course, it is the first day of school here, so I do want to mention it's quiz time. Short quiz. Who can tell me, and someone can raise their hand if they know the answer, what is the United States' Independence Day? Anybody want to venture to guess what Independence Day is? You can shout it out if you want. July 4th. Yeah, July 4th, right? July 4th, 1776. Technically not true. July 2nd is Independence Day, officially. 1776, Continental Congress voted for independence on July 2nd. Reason why it's July 4th is kind of a happy accident. They do the signing, they get kind of it's kind of published in the newspapers and that sort of thing, so it gets kind of the idea that July 4th is our Independence Day. So we can't even get our founding story correct. July 2nd is actually the Independence Day that we have. And in fact, John Adams writes in his diary, actually I think it's a letter he writes, that July 2nd will be celebrated with illuminations and fire and parades and bonfires, and boy was he wrong. It's July 4th, right? It's kind of a happy accident that it shows that. But where do these stories come from? How do these things get changed over time? Well, it really starts with American history class. We've all been in school for the most part. We've gone through history class probably multiple times. I think of 5th and 6th grade as being those formative experiences. That's where you really learn some really meat stuff. And then as you get older, you start to see that everything's not exactly how you thought it was in 5th grade. And American history class is really where it starts, but it's really textbooks that get this. And that's because textbooks are easy, they're simple, they're written with a specific aim in mind, and they're often neat. They want to make sure American history is neat and tidy, and there's no question whatsoever, this is on the test, you're going to learn it, you're done. And that's not how it works. There's so much nuance, more nuance to the stories. And how do these historical myths, why are they so pervasive? Well, primarily, historical myths and stories, they're neat, memorable factoids devoid of any controversy, right? A date, a place, a person. We don't need to know about Cortez's personal life. Well, if we know a little bit more about Hernando de Cortez, it might tell us a little bit more about the story of history in Mexico and in the world. And so these memorable factoids are great for us to remember, but they are not really that, they don't really help in the long run because they don't really give you a fuller understanding, and by the way, my last name is Fuller, so I'm going to make that joke tonight, fuller understanding of history as an idea. They fit nicely into colossal overarching narratives, like, for example, patriotism. Patriotism is usually number one when it comes to these narratives. We want stories to make us feel patriotic about our country, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be nefarious when you start talking about how certain people don't fit those narratives. Alexander Hamilton is a great example of this. People often see Alexander Hamilton as a villain. Oh, he's in a duel. Oh, he's advocating for businesses over the farmer that Jefferson talked about. Alexander Hamilton is probably one of the more interesting stories of the Founding Fathers. Thomas Jefferson is not as saintly as you would think he was. He's kind of like the first demagogue in American history, and he certainly was kind of a thug when it came to personal attacks. So patriotism is a huge part of these narratives. Sometimes it's a religious narrative. If you grew up in a church, especially if it's Catholic or Lutheran, you do have these ideas about history kind of following a narrative, whether it's Martin Luther after or the Crusades or whatever you're talking about. These fit into these narratives as well. Economic narratives, if you're a staunch communist, oftentimes that kind of clouds how you see history. Social awareness, how are men and women in these kind of narratives as well. And then also otherworldly. There's always that one person who says, well, the aliens did it, right? There's always that one fringe historian who always seems to be on the History Channel. There's always that idea too, but it fits neatly into this narrative that the pyramids are weird, so that aliens must be the ones that did it. Patriotism and all of these other things, they are nice stories that make us feel things, but they don't necessarily instruct us on what actually happened. They are often manufactured, and they make history look a little more rosier and to inspire positive feelings. This also fits into the school category. It'd be very difficult to convince a 5th grade teacher to tell students about how bad the Crusades actually were. If you're learning about the Crusades, you're going to learn that, oh, it's a fight that happened, knights and castles, and that's it. You're not going to go into the details because it's a little disturbing to talk to that about 5th and 6th graders. However, it's funny because when we think about manufacturing stories, there's a lot of bad things happening in the world today. And in fact, it can actually help you relate things historically if you talk of both of those things as a narrative. Inspiring positive feelings is not necessarily a bad thing. Oftentimes in American history, people have written stories about founding fathers primarily to make us feel better about that time period. But if you had a time machine go back in time, you'd find out these people were pretty sleazy. Some of them were pretty bad people. Some of them are really good people, but no one really talks about them. And so it's really those things, when we talk about stories, they get manufactured sometimes because people want things to be a little bit happier than they actually were. They are often perpetuated without question of sources or context. Oftentimes this is the social media thing. Usually somebody will post something like, hey, did you know, I always think of, the funniest example I can think of is Abraham Lincoln visiting prostitutes. I don't know where they got that information, but when you pass it around social media, suddenly it becomes truth, right? because, hey, grandma passed it to me, and I passed it to my uncle, and he passed it to his friend, and it just gets almost meme-worthy. And so when we talk about the internet is a great source of information, but where are the sources? Where are the context? How is this fitting in with some sort of a story related to what we are talking about? And so when you think about this, you got to really think about what the sources are. And that's generally thinking what a historian would think like. Think about sources primarily. They're also used as ammunition in culture wars, right? It's very easy to shut somebody up about, let's say, the national anthem or the flag when you can use historical information as an ammunition. So you can pull out that Betsy Ross quote and say, how dare someone not stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance or the flag? Or another person can say, well, the Founding Fathers were terrible people, and therefore we shouldn't care about the Constitution or care about laws in general. It's one of those things that you can use it for whatever aim you want to. And historians certainly use it too sometimes. You have to really think about what are we using these historical tidbits, these stories for? We have to really think about that as well. And of course, this one is number one reason why myths are so pervasive. People want them to be true, so they are. I want George Washington to be a patriotic person, so therefore he is. It's one of those things, it's a confirmation bias. We want to confirm what we already feel, what we already know, and so oftentimes people want these stories to be true, so they become truth over time. So we have to really think about how stories are created. Sometimes it's just a happy accident, but sometimes it's very specific on how it's done. Now, when we're talking about narrative, this is one of the things that I actually talked about with a coworker at Stroke Study. It's very funny that patriotism often plays a huge role in this. And I'm going to show you this video. It's from Epcot Center in Florida. It's from the American Adventure. Has anyone ever been to Epcot Center? Who's been to the American Adventure? Oh, you've heard this wonderful song from the 1980s. It's a lovely little rendition called Golden Dream. It's from the American Adventure Pavilion, and it's played at the end of this retrospective that you've seen throughout American history. So you see Revolutionary War soldiers, you see Civil War, it's a lot pilgrims, that sort of thing. And they play this at the end to give you really inspired about American history. Nothing ever bad happened ever again, and America lived happily ever after. So do you feel patriotic, though? That makes you feel patriotic. It makes you feel excited about American history. The problem is that none of that really tells a story. It's nitpicking specific golden moments. In fact, the song is called Golden Dream. The first line, America, spread your golden wings, sail on freedom's wind across the sky. That's really heavy-handed imagery, if you ask me. A freedom is not a wind. Freedom is fought for. People die for freedom. It's not as simple and simplistic as this movie makes it out. And of course, this, I feel like when you look at this, the narrative is America too great? And don't get me wrong, there are wonderful things about America. There's wonderful things that people have done in the past. However, those are all result of Americans making decisions, people making decisions to do things better. Now, there's other things, too, that we neglect. Part of this movie, too, that they have, there's talks about slavery, and they have a counterpoint with, I think, Chief Joseph, if I remember correctly. But again, it's lost in this idea that, well, we've got dissenting voices, and we've got issues. You saw some imagery of Vietnam, you see some imagery of the women's rights movement, but it's all just these little stories that kind of get shunted aside for this idea that we're all gold and everything's golden. No, a society is built on people making choices that are hopefully positive, and American history is hopefully a lot better. But when we talk about this, we can't just sugarcoat it. I mean, I feel like you could just like, I feel like you get diabetes, you get sugar rush from this. It just feels like you're just bathed in American patriotism, and to be honest, it misses the whole point of American history. American history is to look at what was happening in the past and try to connect with people. I don't feel very connected. I feel excited about America, but I don't feel connected with people. So, again, nostalgia is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something that we should be considered when we're thinking about these alternative facts in American history. So, tonight we're going to explore a lot of ground and shatter some myths along the way. I apologize if it hurts a little bit, but you deserve an American narrative that is more powerful and more more nuanced than what you were taught. So, quick lesson here. We're going to finish the lyric. In 1492, who? That's right, and I think a couple of you probably could say the entire poem. And by the way, if you're interested in that poem, I made some copies tonight. You're welcome to take one home with you as a nice memento tonight. But how many ships did he sail in? 3. Who can name them? Yes, Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, right? Every person 30 years or older should know Columbus. For good or for evil, Columbus looms large in our collective history. We have 2 state capitals named after him. We have a country in the Western Hemisphere named after him. Our nation's capital is named after him. And streets are named after all over the world, specifically in the Western Hemisphere. And there's also a city in Wisconsin, right? Columbus, Wisconsin. Why so much love for Columbus? Also, why so much hate for Columbus? Columbus is the seminal picture, the person that people often point to, whether good or bad, that shows that American history isn't exactly what the narrative states. And we have a whole national holiday for him, right? October. We're celebrating, a lot of times it's celebrating Italian heritage, usually. By the way, the first Columbus Day was celebrated in 1866. And of course, this is right about when people start getting this feeling of nostalgia for colonial days, which is kind of weird to think about in 1866. But you do have a national holiday. You also have a national debate over his legacy. You have people celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day as a kind of a protest against Columbus Day. Some schools don't celebrate Columbus Day. Columbus Day is often maligned in a lot of different urban areas and in certain states. And to be honest, it's a little unfair to Columbus just because he didn't look for his own holiday. That was something that was bequeathed to him. And certainly not everything that Columbus did was necessarily wrong. But remember, the law of unintentional consequences, things change when we talk about these voyages of exploration that happened in the New World. And I'm not saying Columbus is innocent, but I'm also not going to take him to task over these things. You can read it all online. There's plenty of websites that take Columbus to task, and there's certainly several books you could read about. And one of the things I should mention before we start, no one believed that the Earth was flat. That was like a medieval thing. By the time Columbus rolls around, there is not a single person who would believe the world was flat, unless you're one of those flat Earth people. But generally speaking, most people realized the world was a globe. But Columbus himself, the person, is an interesting character. He's an Italian working under the crown of Spain and is on a voyage of conquest. Make no mistake, he's not on a voyage of discovery. Discovery comes second. Conquest comes first. Remember, the 2 monarchs that Columbus is working for, King Philip, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, they are both looking for more money. They just fought a costly war against the Moors, the Islamic peoples of Spain, and they finally kicked them out of the country of Spain. And they're looking to expand horizons into the New World, which, of course, they had been exploring little by little as time went on. And Columbus is not the first, and he's not the last Spanish adventurer into the New World. And it's interesting, too, because when we think of Columbus as a person, we think of him as an American, right? We think of Columbus as an American-speaking person. No, he spoke Italian. He probably spoke just a little bit of Spanish, which is ironic because I don't know how he took his orders from the Queen and King, not knowing Catalan or Spanish in general. But he was a person that was sent on a voyage of conquest. It was discovery, of course, happened along the way, but they were going out into the world to take over something. So Columbus actually has 4 voyages. When we think of the story of Columbus, we think of that first voyage, right? The Nina, the Pinta, Santa Maria, the ships are leaking, they're lost, there's people sleeping on board, they don't know where they're going, and then suddenly land ho, they end up on the continent. No, they end up in the Bahamas, an island group, of course, in the Bahamas. And who are the first people they encounter? Were the Taino people of the Bahamas. And of course, Columbus, not knowing where he is, considered them Indians, called them Indians, because he thought he was in India, thought that they'd gone all the way around the world and reached India. And this partly has to do with navigation at the time. They don't have necessarily the fancy instruments that we have today. They can understand how latitude works, because that's just imaginary lines on a globe, but they have no idea about longitude. They don't know how far they are. They just keep going and going until they run into a rock. And so Columbus actually makes 4 voyages to the New World, and each one has its ups and downs. The first voyage, he narrowly escapes getting killed a few times. The idea is that on the second voyage comes out looking for gold, which means, of course, enslaving people. It doesn't take long for slavery to be introduced into the New World. And what they're doing is they're searching along these islands. They go to Cuba, they go to what's called Hispaniola, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. And they're on a voyage of conquest. The Taino people that they greeted in Bahamas, essentially, they disappear after about 10, 15 years, never to be heard of again. And these places that they visit, of course, they bring their diseases with them. That's an unintended consequence. They're not necessarily giving people, disease blankets. They're coughing on them. They're sick. They leave pigs off their ships. Those pigs become feral. They become something different. There's trade that happens between them. It's not all bad, but there is a lot of negative things that happen. And also, would you believe that Columbus was a terrible administrator? Yes, the hero of discovery was an awful administrator. In fact, he's a pretty poor sailor, but he's an even worse administrator. By the time his 3rd voyage comes around, the people that he's working with, the colonists, they're Spanish colonists, they do not like him because, number 1, he's a foreigner. Number 2, he doesn't know what he's doing. And number 3, he constantly is looking for gold, which, of course, is kind of a drag on people's time when they're trying to build a colony. And so what do? They petition to the crown that Columbus be sent back to Spain in chains, which he was. The whatever magistrate you want to talk about, they clapped irons on him against his will and threw him on a ship, sent him back to Spain to answer what the heck happened. This is something that is interesting because just shortly before, he was kind of the hero, and now he's the villain. People don't like Columbus. In fact, by the time his 4th voyage rolls around, he's a very bitter man. His family petitions, when Columbus dies, actually, his family petitions the crown that he get more money, that his family receive a payment from the crown for all these voyages of discovery. To be honest, that's a pretty facetious idea that they're just going to give money to some person's family, when in reality Columbus wasn't the only person. There was all these other people that worked with him that also were part of the story. But it's a little ironic that he is given kind of the bum's rush at the end. He's a hero for a little while and then becomes this person that everybody's almost universally hated. And of course, by that point, Columbus, who had been eclipsed by all of these other conquistadors that had come through and had conquered in Mexico and in Chile and along the Pacific coast of South America. So he's eclipsed over time. And yet, in America, we really want to hold on to something as Columbus is the first one. And I always think about this in terms of my own life. I think about 5th grade and 5th grade history class. What do we learn about? The voyages of discovery. That's a very simplistic way of thinking about what voyages of conquest are, right? All the names on here, for the most part, are not doing voyages for the good of man to go explore. It's not like space travel. They're looking to conquer something. So you have people like Bartholomew Diaz and Amerigo Vespucci. By the way, America is named after Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci didn't do much, so just FYI. You've got Vasco da Gama, you've got Juan Ponce de Leon, Ferdinand Magellan, Hernando Cortez, Pizarro. All of these guys, we like to neatly pack them into this idea that which one is the red line, which one is the pink line, which is the yellow line. And we really don't give context to or a second thought about what this all means. The New World, the Western Hemisphere, is irrevocably changed by these voyages of conquest. And it's not all good. Some of it is good for in some cases, but usually it's pretty negative. And unfortunately, Columbus gets the brunt of it, but so does Cortez. I mean, Cortez oftentimes gets a lot of brunt in Mexico, of course, because destroying the native population. Cortez also has a person with him, a woman by the name of Malintzin or Malinche, which pardon my language here, but when they say Malinche in the Spanish-speaking world, they mean bitch. And that's because she was a collaborator. She worked with them, but she didn't really have much of a choice. A native woman who's being forced to be a translator for a conquistador, But again, she's blamed as well. So when we talk about these stories, these exploration stories, they are much more complex than just charts and lines. And when we think about it, it really gets messy very quickly. And the idea is that American history is much more nuanced beyond what the stories of Columbus. And of course, Columbus turns into a poem. It's very easy to celebrate Columbus Day as kind of a neat little encapsulation of history. But people do this with a lot of historical figures. And so I bring up Columbus just because that's kind of the granddaddy of them all. But I also think of, and I'm from Illinois, don't hold that against me, but growing up in Illinois, we had a special day that we celebrated called Kazimierz Pulaski Day. And if any of you have Polish heritage, you might know Kazimierz Pulaski. Was Revolutionary War, kind of one of those adventurers that was brought in to help the Revolutionary War effort. He didn't do much, but he's lionized as Kazimierz Pulaski Day. It's celebrated in certain pockets in the northern suburbs of Chicago and in northern Illinois, and it's meant to celebrate Polish heritage. Now, granted, Kazimierz Pulaski is pretty innocuous as a historical figure, but it's a story about who do we choose to be our heroes and who do we choose to be our villains. So I wanted to mention, too, that Columbus, of course, that story is so much richer than the stories that we were told back in the day because, to be perfectly honest, Columbus didn't find America. He didn't discover America. In fact, the Vikings made it to America a lot longer. Now, granted, it's Canada, so it doesn't count, I guess. But they came to a place called Anse au Midi, which is in Nova Scotia, or it's Newfoundland, and they set up colonies in the New World. And of course, this is long before they really know. The Vikings just keep sailing. They keep sailing and sailing. Leif Erikson, they find colonies in Iceland and Greenland, and eventually end up in Canada. The story of this colony isn't very successful, but again, who gets to say who discovered America? Is it Columbus, because that's the narrative we've always heard? Or is it something else? Is it something a little bit more complex? Is it something that challenges that neat little narrative about Columbus Day that we can celebrate in October? Everybody break out their Italian flags and celebrate Columbus Day in terms of a pageantry. It gets a little different. It's different than what we've typically heard. And again, we're not necessarily doing it because we want to denigrate Columbus or any of these other people, but we also want to expand the narrative. We can connect with more of these explorers when we can connect with more of our personal and cultural heritages. I'm not Italian, so I don't have much of a love for Columbus, but I do have heritage that is somewhat of Norwegian and Swedish descent. I can feel a little bit more connected to that. Now, granted, that is a narrative as well, but it is something I think could connect people to stories in the past. And of course, Anse au Midi is discovered in the 1960s, so the books are just probably now being written about this. But it's a little less dull and depressing as some of the stories that we've heard over time. Now, I have to admit, this story actually did almost get me. I don't know, has anyone ever read 1421 by Gavin Menzies? It's a good story. And that's about it. It's a good story. Gavin Menzies is a cartographer. He worked for the British Navy. And his whole thing was discovering the fact that the Chinese discovered America in 1421. Now, to most American scholars and historians, that's a huge thing. Tell us more about the evidence you suggested. And unfortunately, the evidence lines up a little too neatly. Oftentimes in history, we have a lot of evidence, a lot of contradictory evidence. Something says one thing, one says another. We kind of find a middle ground between the two. But in this case, Mr. Menzies, all of his discoveries were correct according to him. So he said, oh, well, I found this, and this backed up my theory. And I found this, and it backed up my theory. And this found this, and this, and this. And it's a little too neat for it to be necessarily credible. Of course, historians pick apart his argument, and they basically say, you have zero proof about this. All of your ideas are assertions, and you can't necessarily cite any of this because there's no documentary evidence. What's the reason? Well, a big fire burned up all these documents. The stones eroded away. You guys are just attacking me because I'm changing the narrative. And to be honest, when I read this book, I was like, wow, this is really cool. But I almost fell for it. I almost fell for the fact that it's not necessarily truthful. It may sound cool, and it certainly is cool because it really challenges that Columbus narrative that we were talking about, but it also is not real. It may not be real, and just because you want it to be true doesn't make it true. So when we talk about alternative facts, this writer is a great example of operating an alternative fact that isn't necessarily true when you kind of shine that light of historical inquiry on it. And again, it's very easy to prove someone wrong when their only defense for your theory is, well, you're just attacking me because you're jealous. That's not a response. That's not a normal response. So you have to have actual evidence to prove that. So again, we talk about the colonization of America. We talk about the discovery of America. There are so many different things we can bring into this narrative. And sometimes you can be fooled. And historians are fooled all the time. But it is something that I think is worth noting because, again, these sort of things do prop up over time. Now, let's talk a little bit more about some cherished American narratives. Here's a great one. These are the Pilgrims. Everybody loves a pilgrim, right? The buckle hats, the turkey at Thanksgiving, the religious toil. You can see it on this painting here. I believe this is one of the ones that's in the U.S. Capitol. One of these ones is in the Capitol, I think. And of course, we're talking about the narrative of the Pilgrims, right? The dissenters, the original dissenters of America, the people that we can connect with from the Revolutionary War to this ancient time where they are freeing religious persecution so that they can be who they are, they can live how they want to be, and be free of any outside influence. Well, it's not quite the same story when you shine that light again. The Pilgrims are religious dissenters for sure. They are dissenters from the Church of England. And they believed that the Church of England was too Catholic. They thought the Catholicism had infiltrated what was left of that idea. And so they wanted to break away from Anglicanism and start their own church. And by the way, this ties in with those wars of religion that are happening all across the continent. The religious defense in terms of Martin Luther and Catholicism, it all comes to a play inside of this story here. And again, that's not a very neat story. We're expanding that narrative. And it's a tidy foundational myth that makes us feel good about our opportunity to freely express our religions, right? We really want to feel like we have the freedom of religion because that's something that's written in our Constitution. That's a God-given right? And we want to connect with them because they had that same feeling too. Well, they didn't really thought that either. Now, here's a good example, 1620. By the way, has anyone ever been to Plymouth Rock before? It's kind of disappointing. Yeah, it really is. It's kind of a tourist trap. I mean, if you can see it right here, don't bother going there. You'll see it. It's cool. It's a big old rock. But it's one of those great tourist traps, much like Wall Drug, Lookout Mountain, and Niagara Falls. It sounds cool, but it really is very disappointing. But Plymouth Rock and the founding of the Plymouth Colony, Pilgrims are an extreme form of Puritanism. By the way, Puritans and Pilgrims are separate. They are not the same thing. If you left a Pilgrim and a Puritan in the same room, they would not agree with each other, much like most Puritans. And they increasingly believed that separation from the state religion was important. They believed that the English Bible was important to read. They had a very strong emphasis on reading the Bible, not having someone tell you what it was like, very much like Americans today. We don't want to be told what to think. They believed in predestination, of course, so they didn't know whether or not someone was damned to hell or saved. It just kind of was a big guess whether or not they were saved or not. They didn't believe in idolatry, which meant they didn't believe in having church buildings. They also didn't believe in having crosses permanently displayed, because that's some sort of idolatry. They did not celebrate sacraments except for baptism and communion. They did not celebrate holidays. So when we think of these wars of the war against Christmas and stuff, the Pilgrims did not celebrate Christmas. They did not, because they thought it was a form of idolatry. It was taking away from the idea of celebrating God and his prominence. They believed in civil marriage, believe it or not. They believed that marriage was a civil thing, and it was not had anything to do with religion. They did not get married in church. They got married by the magistrate because they figured the marriage would never be as perfect as the marriage between God and them. And so marriages were civil. They did not have anything to do with religion. And so when we think about Pilgrims, we think of kind of religious people. And in some ways they are, but in some ways they are very different than what we would like to think them as being. The Pilgrims, by the way, when they left England, they fled to the Netherlands. They didn't go straight to America. They fled to the Netherlands, and they were able to live out their religious duties as much as they can. But guess what? They were afraid that they were going to lose their English heritage. In fact, it was called Dutchification. They were worried about becoming too Dutch. I guess they were worried about wearing the shoes and that sort of thing. But they fled on their ships and sailed to America. Where were they going? Well, they were hoping to land somewhere in New York, and somehow, by grace of God, I guess, landed in Massachusetts. Happy accident again, to build a colony. And of course, things didn't go so well. If you've ever read about Pilgrims before, you know about starving time. You know about how they brought a little too many men, not so many women, which is kind of a problem for keeping your birth rate up in the new colony. And of course, they didn't bring many people who were very strong workers. They brought a lot of religious folks, but not necessarily someone who can do the basic tasks that you need to do to keep a colony going. But it is one of those things that we think about when we think about the first Thanksgiving, right? The first Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims, this all gets blended together. And to be honest, the Thanksgiving, this is one among many feasts that they have. And the feast is basically celebrated as a hooray, we didn't starve kind of thing. And the idea was that they did celebrate with Wampanoag Indians, which, by the way, that is true. But again, it's a little more nuanced than that. It's not, these Indians that these native peoples that are, I shouldn't say Indians, these native peoples are with them. This isn't as benign as we like to think of this picture, right? It's not rosy and everybody's eating together and celebrating. It is tense. It is very tense. And the Pilgrims, of course, come at a time when native peoples and these settlers, the tensions are starting to rise. And this is 1620. This is not that long ago, but they have a lot of contact with these new settlers, and there's tensions that are rising here. It's not as idyllic as we like to think of it. And again, Thanksgiving is a neat little tidy story, right? It makes us feel good about when our siblings can't get along. Well, we can say, well, hey, those Pilgrims got along with the native peoples. They did fine. Yeah, no, they didn't. And there was a good reason for that. We also think about stories like this. This is a tidy story that we can tell kids, right? It's a very easy thing for us to mention. We can talk about turkey at Thanksgiving. And by the way, they did eat turkey at Thanksgiving. However, they also ate lobster. They ate clams. They ate venison, ham, passenger pigeon, swan, and goose and duck. Boy, I don't know how they even stood up after eating that. But all of that stuff, the story is a little bit more nuanced, right? It's easy to say just turkey and stuffing, but it is a little bit different. And this, of course, gets jumbled into patriotism. It gets jumbled into school plays, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But again, the story is a little bit more complex than we make it. It's not just tidy little pilgrims eking out their existence. Shortly thereafter this, after they'd survived a couple of winters, their population is really, really low. And in fact, the Pilgrims colony isn't that all successful. It gets combined with a lot of other Puritan groups that come in later on. And that eventually becomes what we would refer to as Massachusetts. And so all of these things blend together. The Pilgrims are just that first start of that. When we talk about them wanting to celebrate religious tolerance, they want religious tolerance for themselves, nobody else. Quakers, if we think of Quakers coming to this country, they were also an offshoot in England. Pilgrims, Puritans, hated Quakers. They thought Quakers were going straight to hell. Quakers, it's kind of funny because it's not like Quakers wanted to fight them. I mean, they believed in nonviolence. But there was all sorts of tensions between the two. And when we think about American citizens, the colonies are just a jumble of people hating each other. Whether it's Massachusetts hating Rhode Island, or Rhode Island hating Connecticut, or New York getting into trouble with everybody, or all these other places having troubles. We think about Massachusetts being a Puritan stronghold, places where people are celebrating God in a certain way. Well, you go down to Maryland, and there's Catholic. You go down to Virginia, and it's Anglican. If you go to South Carolina, it's just a jumble of people together trying to eke out an existence in the New World. So colonies in themselves, they're not a country yet. Then they have to learn how to become a country. And a lot of it's because they kind of design these myths around it. Speaking of myths, we also think of the Puritans. Puritans are often given kind of a mixed bag here. Usually it mixes in with this Thanksgiving or harvest thing. And this is a great picture because it shows a girl with a jar lid. They didn't have jar lids back then. But you've got the buckles, you've got that pageantry, the Puritans celebrating in the New World, and that Protestant work ethic, right? That thing that we love to hear when our parents want us to go outside. They say, well, the Protestant work ethic, we got to get going and get working. And to be honest, I'm not slamming the Protestants for working hard. They did. They worked really hard. But so did everyone else who lived in a colony. You don't get to slack off because it's either that or starvation. And so oftentimes the Puritan story is interesting because we often think of it as either positive or negative. Positive in the sense that this is a community of people working for that shining city on a hill. That's what we always hear. I think Ronald Reagan used that terminology as well. Or we think it negatively. Oh, you're so Puritan. You're a prude. You're a person who doesn't believe in freedom. And to be honest, that's a pretty accurate idea about what Puritans believed in. The community of Puritans that develop in the East Coast, they're strictly adhere to these religious and moral codes. They're very litigious in court, just like most Americans, and are primarily focused on the health of their utopian society. If you think about the Puritans this way, it's almost like, I wouldn't call it a cult, but I would call it a group of people that would work together in an isolated place that would believe in the community more than the individual. And so they believe in all sorts of crazy things. And when I say crazy, I'm using a modern term. But they believe in a lot of strict adherence to moral code. So these are evangelical Calvinists. They're looking to save all by instituting a strict discipline. They don't care so much about property laws. In fact, back in Puritan times, you could have your cows all over the neighborhood. Didn't matter. No one would care about it. But if you talk in church, oh boy, it's not going to turn out well. This is called a bilbo, and if you've ever read The Hobbit, it's kind of the same thing. But the bilbo is like a stock for your feet. They'd put you on your back, and you'd put your feet in the stock, and they'd make you sit there for a few hours out in the cold or in the heat and make you think about what you did wrong. Talking in church, I guess. Here's another one, a wanton gospeler, a person who is speaking about Puritanism, talking about religion without the minister at play. Branding was a popular one against Quakers because they wanted to make sure you didn't cause trouble for their community. It's not a community you necessarily want to be living in because swearing, extramarital sex, breaking the Sabbath, and challenging religious authority were not allowed whatsoever. In fact, you're kicked out of the colony. It's a communal thing. So people like Roger Williams, who starts the colony of Rhode Island, is kicked out. A lady named by the name of Anne Hutchinson, if you've ever read that story, she's kicked out for talking about religion, which is ironic because you'd think Puritans would want more people to be interested in God and these things. And she gets kicked out because she was doing it in spite of the minister. So again, you have to think about how these things fit together. The Puritans, it's not a great society to live in. In fact, most people, this is probably where Rhode Island, Vermont, Delaware, and some of these other ones get their independent streak, is because they basically buck this trend and say, forget about it. In fact, Rhode Island is the last state, last colony to join the Union of 13 because they know they don't want to be part of this again. They've seen what happens with unity. So again, when we talk about colonial times, this is a lot harsher. It's a lot worse than what we were taught because it's easy to be tidy with Puritans, to make them benevolent Christians who want only the best for society. They really don't. They want to stick to their principles and not have anybody question it. One of my favorite stories, by the way, is Jamestown. It's the other foundational myth. We have two foundational myths in our country, actually three. One is Columbus. The second is Plymouth. And the third is Jamestown. Jamestown is a much more interesting story. It's one I can relate to. 1607, it's about 13 years before the Pilgrims land. It's a colony that's started by a company. In fact, it's a corporation that owns this colony. And they start a colony in the New World. None of these people necessarily have much good experience in knowing how to manage a colony. They mess it up pretty bad. They fight with the natives very regularly. And somehow they're still somehow successful. I feel like I could relate a little bit more in terms of failure to this group as opposed to the saintly Puritans, the Pilgrims. We can't really live up to that standard, nor do we really want to. But Jamestown is always kind of the twin point of this. Jamestown is the one that fails. Jamestown burns down, by the way, several times. It gets flooded. It's built in the swamp, probably the worst possible place to build a colony. And again, it's one of those founding stories that often get shunted aside for that pilgrim myth. We like the pilgrim myth better. It's better to think about industrious people rather than Jamestown, which is a bunch of drunks going into the woods and trying to find, chopping down trees, getting into brawls, getting into fights. And of course, the best story that comes out of Jamestown is the Pocahontas story. Who's ever seen the movie, Disney movie, Pocahontas? You're a little too old for this one, I guess. Kristen knows, yeah. Pocahontas, a Disney-fied story. Pocahontas is a story of the daughter of the chief Powhatan, which, by the way, has a way different name in history. It's very hard to pronounce. But he has a daughter named Pocahontas, which, by the way, Pocahontas is actually more of an epithet you would give to a little girl. It means little mischief. Her real name was probably Mataoka, and the idea of the story is that she has some sort of romantic entanglement with a strapping John Smith, played by Mel Gibson, or voiced by Mel Gibson in the Disney version. So this whole romantic element between a native person and a colonist and how they bridge the gap between whatever, I guess, like multiculturalism or something, the idea that somehow that's what saves the colony. Well, the story would be very disturbing if it was a romantic entanglement. Pocahontas, or Mataoka, is 11 years old when she meets John Smith. John Smith is 28 years old. And by the way, John Smith is not the hero of the story. He is a mutineer. He mutinies on the boat over. The crew throw him in the jail, in the brig, and they're going to hang him as soon as they arrive in Jamestown. It's not a place for the simple person. According to John Smith, who, by the way, was a notorious booster of his own life. He's really, if you think about John Smith, think about a pirate. Think about someone who gads about on islands, tells stories, is only out for themselves and only in it for the money. That's the kind of person John Smith is. He's not a strapping young man who's trying to make his way in the world. No, he's a braggart, a drunk, and a pirate. And he likes to tell all these stories. And of course, the story about John Smith and Mataoka, that comes out after Mataoka dies. She's in the ground, and all the people that could question this story, they're no longer around to tell the story. So John Smith, of course, invents all this stuff to have been. When we talk about the Pocahontas story, too, she saves his life in the story that Smith tells. The story is that John Smith is punished because he was fighting with the native peoples. He's sentenced to die by clubbing. They're going to take a club and knock his brains in. And Pocahontas, she jumps in and saves the day, and then everything was fine and rosy and nothing ever bad happened. No, most likely, if John Smith was captured, even if he was captured, he would have been burnt to death. He would have been put on a stake and burnt or tortured. His daughter didn't have any significant clout with the chief, so she wouldn't even been in that decision. And of course, all of this stuff comes out after the fact. So the story can't even really be considered truthful because there's no intervening evidence that suggests otherwise. And John Smith does not help his case. If he was a sterling person who never told a lie, we may believe him, but it's very difficult to believe him. So that whole Disney-fied idea about these stories, again, Pocahontas is a great story we can throw into a school, we can do it as a Disney film, but it misses the point. The point is that this is just one story among many, and it's actually more interesting the fact that the story of Jamestown is much more nuanced than what we typically think. All right, so we can get to the American stories. George Washington, right? The sacred cow of American history. I cannot tell a lie, he says, right? He gets, well, first of all, this story is troublesome for a number of reasons. He's given an axe, and if you have a boy in your life, the first thing you want to not do is give a little boy an axe. And so his father gives him an axe, or a grandfather in some cases gives him an axe, and he chops down a cherry tree or makes an indent in a tree. Comes back and he says, "What happened?" And he says, "I cannot tell a lie. It was I who did it." And then, of course, the dad, or grandfather in some cases, gives him a hug and says everything's okay. We want this story to be true. We desperately want this story to be true because it makes George Washington into a god, makes him into a hero. He can't tell a lie, so clearly that makes him a good person. And it's one of those things, this story is 100% created. It's an invented story. It's actually by a biographer, Mason Locke Weems. In 1806, writes the 5th edition of a biography of George Washington, includes this story. And he says that this story was meant to be a role model for children. It's not truthful at all, but it sounds true. Which again, that's a very common thing for American history stories. It sounds true, so it is true. And that's not, that's a progression that people think about. And so this is an invented story that's put into a biography that's passed down over and over and over again. 1806 is when this book comes out. If you guys have heard of the McGuffey readers before, well, William McGuffey loved George Washington, loved the fact that he's a moral character and wanting to teach kids about morality. He puts this story into his book. And so that's passed on. It's like a meme today. You just keep passing it on, and it sort of makes it true. It's not true at all. In fact, when I did this research, I looked at Mount Vernon, went straight to the source, and oh boy, you could just hear the frustration in the historians' words about this story, because it's probably the one they hear the most. And in fact, this story actually gets a second life with P.T. Barnum, another person not immune to fake news. P.T. Barnum used this story about George Washington chopping down the cherry tree as a sideshow act. He had a person by the name of Joyce Heth. I don't know if she was in that Greatest Showman movie, but Joyce Heth was claimed to be George Washington's nanny. And by the way, this is in the 1870s, so there's no way. She would have to be 161 years old to be George Washington's nanny. But she'd go on these tours and tell these stories. And where do these stories come from? It comes from this biography. And they talk about George Washington. People love this story because it rings sort of true. And again, this is long after the fact. So people have this nostalgia for Washington. We have this nostalgia for Washington because when we compare him to other presidents, we think, oh, I wish they could all be like Washington. Well, to be honest, Washington wasn't that great of a president, and he wasn't really the smartest person we make him out to be. It's just he's the first person. And it's the easiest person to lionize because he has so many virtues that we want to be true. And so it's funny because this story is 100% invented, and yet it's still added. In fact, political candidates talk about this all the time, and I just want to scream when I hear it because it's like, you're wrong. It's not a true story. It's a good story, but it's not a true story. Speaking of another story that is sort of true, Paul Revere's Ride. By the way, this is not a real painting. This is actually just there's a famous painting where Paul Revere is going like this. This is just him face palming. But Paul Revere's Ride, when we talk about, we talked about Washington, it's more of an invented myth. This one is a myth that balloons over time. It's not invented. There's a moment of truth in there. And again, this is why historical facts and fiction, they're so hard to balance sometimes because you don't necessarily know what's true and what isn't. But in this case, the narrative is a lot wider. When we think about the story of Paul Revere's Ride, what do we think of? What did he say? The British are coming, the British are coming. First of all, that makes no sense. The British people, the people that lived in the colonies, considered themselves British. They didn't know what that meant. Who's the British? He would be shouting this. If you really want to tell that the regulars are coming out, you really don't want to be shouting it because there's patrols all throughout these colonies. They will stop you and they will arrest you. And so if this story is true, then Paul Revere has to be quiet. He has to give the message across, and he has to do it secretly. And so in this case, when Paul Revere did come through, he was very quiet about it. He would go to certain houses to drum up support. And what did he say? He said, the regulars are coming out. Now, that does not sound as bombastic as, the British are coming. You don't say that in a school play, right? And of course, when we think of the story of Paul Revere's Ride, we think of him speaking in a Shakespearean accent. No, he would be talking in a Boston accent. Boston accents still happened in the they were still around, and that connects people with a place. And that's why I think it's funny. Paul Revere is often seen as this mythical figure, riding away and helping people. And it's only one part of the story. Longfellow writes a poem about this, but they omit two other people. There's a man by the name of Dawes, and there's a man by the name of Prescott, who also go out on the same night and go out and tell people. And this story is more interesting because guess what? Two of them get stopped. One of them leaps over a fence and escapes the British patrols. That's much more interesting than just him riding around, joyriding, talking about when the regulars are coming out. It's not as interesting. It's certainly brave, but it doesn't give a lot of stakes. When you talk about this story with those other people involved, you see that this is a lot more intrigue involved. It's a lot more daring involved, and it's a story that you could probably connect to. You could imagine when you get pulled over by the police, you're probably thinking the same thing. What if I just drove away right now? What would happen? And again, it kind of connects us more with this historical narrative when we know the full story. Another one, of course, Betsy Ross. Everybody loves this one. It's another conflated story. It bends the truth a little bit because it makes this, it narrows in on one person. Much like Paul Revere, we're talking about a story that narrates on one person, and that's Betsy Ross. And of course, the idea is that Betsy Ross is given the opportunity to design a flag for George Washington. He loves the flag. He wants to put up the flag. And Betsy Ross is considered as a founding mother, if you will, of our country. And it's something that girls could relate to in history class. If you learn about it, you know, the Revolutionary War is replete with a bunch of dudes. But if you throw in Betsy Ross, oh yeah, now it's for the ladies too. Again, that's a troublesome narrative because there are way more women involved with the Revolutionary War that we could count on than just Betsy Ross. And it's a little reductive to talk just about her as part of this. Now, this story is not quite true. She did help design a flag, and she was involved in this flag thing. But this story, the story of George Washington and Betsy Ross, it comes from the Ross family. So that should tell you something that's not quite true there. And it comes around the time of 1876, which is the Centennial Exposition. Suddenly, they just start telling this story. It seems a bit shady, considering that it's America's 100th birthday. It comes from William Canby, who is a grandson. And of course, they want to capitalize on this, right? I'm Betsy Ross's grandson, blah, blah, blah. And Betsy Ross is a patriotic ideal for girls. Well, there's other people involved. There's a woman by the name of Rebecca Young who designed an earlier flag. In fact, there's a whole debate about this. In fact, you could spend hours reading about this because I know I did. And you can read about some of the things that went along with this flag creation. And flag is, of course, a huge national symbol. We want a story like this to be true. We don't want the story to be, well, they kind of just hobbled together a flag and flung it up. Our first flag had the British Union Jack on it with stripes. That's not interesting. We want to know this whole, ring of stars and stripes. We want all that to be truthful because that's a cool story. It helps us on Flag Day to talk about this. We want it to be true, so it sort of becomes true. But it's much more, again, it's much more deeper than what we want, than it actually is. Of course, this is, I said before, I'm not going to touch too much on the history of slavery because there's a whole nother program and a whole nother month of programs for that. And it's very touchy. But I do want to talk about the Alamo. Has anyone ever been to the Alamo before? Were you excited, disappointed? That was pretty cool. I went in 7th grade, or no, I went in 4th grade, and I was very disappointed because I thought the building was going to be like, you walk in and there's like, a lot of stuff in there. Well, when the Alamo, after this battle, all that was left was the facade. It was just that outer shell. And I remember walking in with my brother and seeing a giant Coke machine right as we walked in. And I said, lame. And even in 4th grade, that was lame. But I remember this because the Alamo is a story that is part of state pride. It's a part of a local story that we really want to connect with, especially if you're from Texas. It's 1836, and it's the pride and joy of Texans. It's a story of heroic Americans holding off the tyrannical Mexican army led by Santa Anna, who of course only has one leg, and fights for the rights of Texans. And of course, these guys are all killed. You've got Jim Bowie, you've got, was it Davy Crockett and the other ones? What's that? Yeah, Travis, yeah. And you've got people in here, the American Front. This is the quintessential American frontier story. They make movies about this. They are telling the story about Texan pride. If you've ever been to Six Flags Great America, they actually have, the Six Flags actually represent the different people that own Texas. And again, that's a story that continually gets passed around because we want it to sound, heroic Americans fighting against something. Well, when we dig deeper, the story gets a little bit messier. And that's because, what are they fighting for? Texans are fighting for slavery. They are fighting for slavery. And that's because the Mexican government in Mexico City says that you can no longer have slaves in any of our territories, no matter what. Slavery is outlawed. And they also outlaw emigration from Americans to Texas, because Texas is a very sparsely populated, and if 40,000 people are Americans, where do you think their loyalties are going to lie? They're going to lie with America. They're not going to lie with Mexico. So they ban slavery, they ban emigration, and of course these Texan landholders, who are slaveholders, get really mad about this, and they say, we're going to fight for our freedom, we're going to fight against this tyranny, and of course they're surrounded and all the combatants are killed. By the way, not everybody died at the Alamo. Non-combatants, children, women, even dogs and certain cattle and stuff were saved. But the ones that were fighting were killed. And of course, this is a rallying point for this war that goes on, Texas independence. They fight literally just a couple skirmishes, and then what's called the Battle of San Jacinto, where the Texans and some American troops rout the Mexican army. Again, the story is much more deeper than we think it is. We think of it as just kind of this small thing that has to do with freedom, because we as Americans love freedom. We love a good story about freedom. But freedom for who, right? It's not a freedom of them just celebrating their Texanhood. It has to do with slavery. And of course, when Texas is admitted to the Union, it's admitted as a slave state. It's part of the Confederacy. It's part of this larger narrative that has to do with race and domination in American history. And we should really think about that rather than just thinking about how brave it was. It was certainly brave. A little foolhardy, too, considering the fact that all you had to do was give up some livelihood. Now, granted, that's a value judgment based on American history. You know, obviously, I can say that in a world without slavery, but back then, you know, it seems almost foolhardily that they would fight for something like that when it's not just freedom. It's freedom to own other people. So when we think about this, this story is always parroted. It's always there. It's part of what makes Texas, Texas, right? Everything's bigger in Texas, or we're fighting for our freedom. They always kind of pull that thing anytime they don't like something the federal government does. We're going to secede. Well, a lot of states like to secede too. In fact, actually the first one trying to secede, Rhode Island. So Rhode Island has a history of that. Minnesota too. But the idea is that this myth, this historical myth, is passed down because we want it to be true. We want it to be about just freedom. But it's messier than that. So how do we connect this with local stories? Well, here in Rock County, here in Janesville, we at the Historical Society have two stories that we love to tell, or used to like to tell. One of them is the Lincoln Boots story. Has anyone been to the Tolman House before? A fair amount. I'm sorry if I'm going to ruin the story for you if you haven't been there, but Abraham Lincoln visits the Tolman House in 1859. And he stays there 2 nights. Why did he stay 2 nights? Well, the night after he stayed, he woke up and found that his boots were missing. And it turned out that one of the servants had taken them out to shine them up for him for his train ride the next day. Well, knowing that, he didn't know this, so he's sitting in his bed waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, Mrs. Tolman and kids kind of get the courage to go up and check on him. They open the door. They knock on the door, and Lincoln opens up. You see that he's only wearing his socks. And of course, it was impolite to walk around someone's house in your stocking feet. And so he says to Mrs. Tolman, I don't want to accuse you of anything, but I seem to have misplaced my boots. And of course, they figure it out pretty quickly about what happened to them. By the time this happens, Mr. Lincoln has already missed his train, and he celebrates that day by going to church with them, cements a relationship between them, and then leaves the next day. It's a nice little, tidy little story that we like to tell. In fact, it's the connection that we have. That's why we call it Lincoln Tolman House. We have that story. Now, you'd probably think, okay, that's a fun little story. That's a neat little one that we could tell about. We also have another one. It's called it's for the Underground Railroad. Has anyone ever heard this story before? Yeah, so once upon a time, the idea was that the Tolman House was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And the idea that the Tolmans were harboring escaped slaves inside the house. There was this whole thing about secret rooms, secret staircases, sliding down the drain pipe. I'm not making this up. This is all in the narration. And then leaving because they would go on the Rock River. Well, this story it was told for a very long time. In fact, admittedly, there's a lot of programming in the 1970s that is very racially insensitive at the Tolman House, and we recognize that as being. So we actually we know this story isn't true, and that's because it falls apart when it comes to historical inquiry. Now, you're probably thinking, hey, wait, both of these stories, and I should mention too, there's also a window involved in that Underground Railroad story. They have a stained glass window, And the idea was that you would flash your lantern in the red if it's unsafe and flash it in the green if it was safe. And I could talk to you all night about how wrong that is. But how do these stories relate to each other? Well, they both are kind of fun little stories. Well, not necessarily fun, but stories that we like to tell. But how are they real? Are they real? Well, here's the thing. The Lincoln Boots story holds up a little bit more because there's actually documentation about this. One of the people who stayed in the house with Abraham Lincoln, the cousin of, or the nephew of the Tallman family, he stays in the same room as Lincoln and can corroborate all of this stuff. He writes in a newspaper article later on. It's a story that's passed in the family, but it's in the newspaper. Not everything's in the newspaper is true, but certainly that one, it held up because there's a first-hand account witness to it. Now, the Underground Railroad story, why does it fall apart? Well, there's a number of reasons. Number one, in 1859, the country is under the Fugitive Slave Law. This has been about seven or 8 years now. The Fugitive Slave Law says anyone harboring slaves can have their house taken away from them, they can go to jail, and they can pay a giant fine, or they can have all three happen to them. Also, there are no secret staircases that you could use to get on, to hide and harbor slaves in there. Going up the Rock River is not a normal path for people escaping to freedom. And the granddaddy of them all, there's a secret tunnel underneath. There was this whole idea that there was a secret tunnel that people would get under. Again, Underground Railroad doesn't mean literally underground. And the whole window thing falls apart too because red and green light, you would have to have the equivalent of a spotlight to see that from the river or from any surrounding area. It's very suspicious if someone's shining a giant light in a window. And also, red and green lights don't mean anything to a person in 1859. Stoplights aren't invented until the 1912, 1913. So what does red and green mean? It could mean all clear. It could mean anything. So that falls apart because we look at it from a historical inquiry perspective, and we kind of try to pick it apart. This is what historians do. And both stories, again, could be labeled as fake, depending on how you see it. But we really have to think about historical inquiry, thinking about expanding that narrative. What does it mean? And of course, the Underground Railroad story fell apart because none of that stuff really held up. And to be honest, too, there was a narrative once upon a time that the Tallman House and the Milton House were linked somehow. Well, they aren't. They are linked in the idea that there are abolitionists, there are people that are involved with that, and of course, the people in Milton and the people in Janesville did have contacts with each other, but there's no way to link it up. Just because we want it to be true doesn't mean it is. And that's a very important thing to think about because we like stories. We love stories. We thrive on stories, but they don't always hold up. So, tips for spotting fake news and fake history. They're kind of the same, similar in the same regard. Sometimes things are fake. Some things they change over time, but the fake news and fake history tend to kind of fall into the same category. So, what are some of the things you can do? Always question the source, not necessarily the information. Now, what do I mean by that? When you're questioning sources, you're looking at who's telling the story, right? Who is telling that story? If it's John Smith, I'm not going to trust that story very much. If it's a reporter, it may be true. We have to think about how these stories change, but it's not necessarily the information that's wrong. Remember, information can be subtly changed a little bit here and there. If I said, you think about the story of Alexander Hamilton, right? You've got two different opinions about that. Alexander Hamilton's a villain. Well, why are you saying that he's a villain? Well, he did X, Y, and Z. Okay, well, how does that fit into your specific narrative? And we talk about narratives again, but information isn't necessarily what we're questioning here. We're questioning the source. The source comes first, and then we question the information. Because again, it generally falls apart when you look at sources. If you look at a newspaper that's called Fun Times Daily, you're probably not going to see that they have very good news, right? It's not going to be, it's maybe some, or even, even sometimes things like online quizzes and stuff. It's not necessarily the information that's wrong, but that source is just really problematic. So as a historian, we always look at the source because source material is usually where the rubber meets the road. And again, sometimes you can be fooled. If you've ever read the newspaper The Onion, sometimes they write pretty good articles and pretty good headlines that will fool you. And then you read it and you go, oh, I've been fooled. I always think of, NPR occasionally does this for April Fool's Day. They'll post something really really inflammatory, and then you click on it and say, did you read the article? And then it's kind of a fun little thing. But again, questioning the source is pivotal to this. So, can you pinpoint who wrote it? When you look at something, you have to kind of understand who's writing this. Now, this gets harder and harder the further back you go because, of course, people don't write like they do in today. But when you think about it, you have to really think about who's writing this, whose feelings are being expressed in this. And that sometimes can affect the way the information is presented. And so it's not that everyone can be so objective about everything. You really have to think about, kind of put yourself into that person's shoes and understand where they're coming from. But pinpointing who wrote it, if it's no one that wrote it, then there's a problem there. Consider the person's bias, but don't dismiss it too quickly. Sometimes bias is we don't like someone's bias. We disagree with them. We hate what they have to say. We think what they say is terrible. We disagree with them fundamentally. Well, here's the thing. Just because it's different than your bias doesn't mean it's necessarily untrue information. You can dismiss it eventually, maybe, but you really have to think about, again, putting yourself into another person's shoes, empathizing with that person, understanding where they're coming from, and understanding how that changes the narrative. When I think of the George Washington story, I can probably forgive Mr. Weems about writing that about George Washington because it's a fun story. But again, don't label it as truth. Label it as this is a story. This is a story in a fiction book. When you put it into a biography, people expect that it's nonfiction. And that's where the lines get crossed. So again, it's really just have to be careful about how that works. Negative information that doesn't fit your exact narrative is probably safe, albeit annoying. Now I say that because there's a lot of things about American history that frustrate me. There's things that I don't like, and I'm sure there's a lot of things that you don't like either. Some things maybe feel like they're too liberal or too conservative or too political or apolitical or religious or non-religious. And to be honest, even though it's negative and it doesn't fit your exact narrative, it still may be true. There still may be an element of truth to that. And again, we have to really check our own selves about what kind of things are we thinking about and how are we affecting those stories. If it's shared through social media, it probably isn't very stellar. So if you see something that says like, historydaily.com, know you, something like that, it's probably not necessarily truthful information. It's just passed around. It's a meme. Maybe it's a nugget. It's a nugget of information, kind of like Columbus, right? You can do this. And a lot of times, and I say this as a historian, sometimes they do it in a very political way, right? Like if you're on the more liberal side or the left side, you may put something like a thing about Christopher Columbus. You'd be like, did you know that he's a murderer? And make it really like a campaign ad. Or you could do the other side and add patriotic music and be like, Christopher Columbus was a God-fearing American. And you could do it either way. Again, social media isn't usually stellar because there's usually some sort of narrative. They want you to feel something. Generally, history does make us feel things. But if you feel angry or you feel like everything you just thought is justified from that post, it probably is not necessarily the most correct information. So when you think about it in that lens. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. It's the age-old advice, right? Someone gives you a thing in the mail that says you just want a cruise. Probably didn't, especially if you didn't sign up for it. And if it's something like, let's say, did you know that, I think of Mr. Rogers used to be a sniper, and he has tattoos on his arms. That's why he wore the sweaters. It's not true. Of course it isn't true. Just because it sounds cool doesn't mean it's true. And it's too good to be true. So like you have to think very strategically about these things because, again, it really can be problematic. And I always say, if you're not sure, check out things like Snopes.com and factcheck.org. A lot of times they do have things about history on there, and you can find some specific sources that back up some of those arguments. Now, granted, they tend to be, there's more kind of political fact-checking, but certainly the job of the historian, of course, is to fact-check politicians about things that they say, because that's not always truthful. But again, when we think about this, do some research, try to find out for yourself. Sometimes things aren't as easy as they seem. If it fits nicely and tidy, it probably isn't. So you have to think about it. And I'm not saying we all have to be jaded about this. We have to be more smart about it. So with that being said, I've got some suggested reading. If you want a good book that will challenge you to your core about American history, read Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Loewen. It's a dense read, but it's a good read. And he takes Columbus to task way more than I did tonight. But it really makes you think about things. Now he says lies. It's not necessarily a lie. It's more of a way to bend something to a narrative. But it is a great read. I highly suggest reading it. I haven't read this one yet, but I'm interested in reading it. It's called Bunk: The Rise of Hoaxes, Humbug, Plagiarists, Phonies, Post-Facts, and Fake News by Kevin Young. That one just came out recently. And of course, Broadcast Hysteria. I have this one on hold from the library. About Orson Welles and the War of the Worlds. That's a great story too. And also there's some elements of fake news and fake history in there as well. But these all kind of blend together, and I challenge you to read some of this stuff. It's very interesting. So that being said, does anyone have any comments, questions, concerns about what I said tonight? I apologize if I... Yes, I will put it back up. Anybody have any questions? I've got a few minutes.
Isn't it only a lie if you know it to be untrue when you tell it?
Right. And that's again too. It's like it's the difference between lies and fibbing, right? You know, it's kind of like I bent the truth, or my favorite is a lie is just a truth mistake, right? It's everyone's to blame but you, right? And so when we think about American history, we really need to think about really going deeper. That's really what the whole point of this program was, to go deeper. Take a story that is maybe a little too neat and kind of pick it apart. Now, that's not to mean that we can't have heroes in American history, we can't have villains in American history, but we should really think about it strategically. Yeah, in the back.
Well, in reading about Charles Lindbergh, I found out all kinds of information that I didn't learn in the 4th and 5th and 6th grade. For one thing, the books that I've read on him, he fathered 3 children out of wedlock by 3 different women. Number 2, he went over to Germany before World War II, and he bragged about the Nazis. He accepted an award from the Nazi government. He was over there examining their airplanes, and he came back to America and said, "Why, these people are fine.
Right.
These Nazis are great."
And ironically too, not the first person to make that transatlantic flight either. So it's kind of funny, like he gets claimed for them. Now obviously the Lindbergh baby story kind of changes that narrative. But you're absolutely right. I think of also the Duke and Duchess of, was it Windsor? Edward VIII abdicating the throne for Wallace Simpson. It's very romantic. It's a very lovely story. But there's a lot of stuff that happens after that, like Nazi sympathizing and potential giving away state secrets, whether intentionally or unintentionally. There's a huge problem there. And again, it's not that he's necessarily a villain or a hero. It's a person. Yes, and more.
Well, Henry Ford, in reading about him, he hated the Jews. And you want to read his book that he wrote on the hatred of the Jews, you will find out.
Henry Ford is probably one of the zaniest people you could probably read about, because obviously we only think of him in the context of making cars and driving away, right? Or Michigan, Detroit, that sort of thing. Did you know that he started his own rubber plantation in Brazil? That was a giant failure. That he hated his son so much that he probably put him to an early grave. Decided that he wanted to build model towns all throughout the Midwest and have people live on soy and other weird things. I think of stories too, and again, that's just broadening it. We're not trying to tackle these people down. We're not trying to knock them down a peg. We're trying to make them more human. They're just as crazy as they are today. We're just as zany as we are today. I think of one of the favorite stories about an innocuous thing in a grocery store, a graham cracker, right? We think of honey graham crackers. We give them to kids. Did you know that it's a health food? It was designed as a health food to... and I quote, to keep down the bodily urges. They would give this as a group. It was essentially a cult that would give these to people so that they had just enough nutrition that they wouldn't think about sex or violence or whatever, I guess. But it started as a health food. You can look it up. It's a very weird story. It was a fad diet, just like there are fad diets today, right? Paleo, It connects us with history. And that's the thing we want to do. If you're going to want to be interested in history, you have to connect with it. And we can't connect with heroes. We can't connect with villains. So who do we connect with? We connect with average people, even people who aren't average. Thomas Edison, the person who probably was not a very nice person. We think of him as a saintly inventor. We think of a lot of inventors that way. They're kind of kooky. Just like most, you think of like Elon Musk today, right? We think, that guy's weird. But again, there's a lot of other people who are weird in American history. It's a continuum. We change. My personal favorite argument is, this is the worst. Anytime anyone says this is the worst I've ever seen in American history. The debate in this country is the worst we've ever seen. Until we're pulling out pistols and dueling people, it is not the worst we've ever seen. And we can get past it. We can find ways to get past it and try to change things for the better. And that's the whole point of history, is to look at the past with an eye to making things better. If we just leave it at the facts, then we're not actually engaging with material or people. And as a kid or as an adult, you're not going to be interested in history. This is why history, people hate it, because it's not interesting. It's boring. Who cares about facts? Who cares about dates? Who cares about people? Well, you would care more if it's about stories that connect you between past and present. People that have the same weird, crazy ideas out there, people that have the same impulses that you and I have. That's the kind of thing that connects us with the past. Any other questions, comments? Well, great. Thank you so much for coming in. I appreciate it.